Redditors who work at cemeteries and graveyards, what strange and scary stuff have you witnessed? I work at a graveyard, and I just have one thing to say. Plastic. Here in Norway, graves are protected by law for 20 years, but after that the spots can be reused. Usually a grave is fine to reopen after 20 years, the body is supposed to be decomposed and pretty much gone. Now back to plastic. Between the 50s and 80s it was common here to be buried in plastic, to minimize smell and leakage. I'm sure they thought it was a good idea back then, but once we started reusing graves in Norway we realized it is a curse. A lot of bodies are wrapped in plastic, and I've myself been part of what was supposed to be a burial at a reused site. The body was about 50 or 60 years old, and should be basically gone. But nope, it was not. The plastic wrap it was covered by kept the body from decomposing, and it's basically just been marinated at its own juices for 50-60 years. The smell was awful, the sight was even worse. I'm sure this is not the kind of story you wanted, but it's honestly the most horrific and bizarre thing I've ever been part of. Not really a cemetery experience, but it was still pretty freaky. My grandparents live out in the middle of nowhere pretty much and is surrounded by woods. On their property, there was a whole family that owned my grandparents' property before them. From what I was told they were killed or something like that. A few years ago, when I was still living with my grandparents, a relative that was related to the dead family came up to the property and wanted to remove the bodies from the land. My grandpa was extremely happy about it because he wanted to expand the house but couldn't because he didn't want to mess with the graves. So they got together and I stood nearby, watching them dig up 4 caskets. There were 3 adult-sized caskets and 1 child-sized casket. And they all looked really old. One of the bigger caskets had holes and cracks all over it. That was the one that my grandpa and the other relative was carrying when the body fell out the bottom of the casket. The body was pretty much bones but it still had old muscle and tissue on it. I remember feeling sick to my stomach as I watched them uncomfortably put the body back into the casket upside down. Former funeral director here. My partner and I had just gotten back to the funeral home from a house call for a 31-year-old woman who died of cancer. As we were moving her body from the cot to embalming table we heard an audible click and the radio across the room turned on full volume of static. It's one of those old radios you turn the volume dial until it clicks to turn it on. We both looked at each other. He was an extremely religious man and this event visibly shook him and he left not long after the incident. I shut the radio off as I typically used my phone to listen to music while embalming. When I'd finished the procedure and was attempting to move her from the embalming table to a dressing table I heard that click from that old radio and it turned on full volume yet again. At that point I was fairly freaked out and made my exit not long after. My partner and I never spoke of it again and nothing like that ever occurred to my knowledge before or after. In the cemetery mausoleum chapel where I occasionally play the organ for funerals, vandals had broken in the night before a service. They smashed several crypt covers, probably with sledgehammers, exposing the remains of those that had been entombed therein. It was an eerie atmosphere to hold a funeral service that morning with such desecration in plain sight. I used to do some odd jobs at the 12th century graveyard in my hometown. 12th century, as in the church and its surrounding graveyard had been in continuous use for at least that long. When you keep burying bodies in the same small patch of ground for that many centuries, eventually the soil has been turned over dozens of times and consists mainly of bone fragments. You can't even plant flowers there without accidentally uncovering some teeth or finger bones or something. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under the thin turf. The soil sort of resembles seaside shell sand, except on closer examination all the light-colored bits are bone fragments rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, just a bit eerie until you get used to it. You learn to treat anything recognizable as human remains with respect, and just tuck it away out of sight under the plant or whatever else you were putting there. Former funeral director here. One of our workers cleaned up after everyone had left from a visitation viewing wake. It was about 9 PM or later and he saw one last guest walking around in the visitation room. He went to help escort the gentleman out when he discovered no one was in there. When he came back in and told us the story and described the visitor, he identified the man in a photo we had at the funeral home. It was my grandfather, family business, who had recently passed. My dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did yard work, mowing, weed eating, flower beds, etc. Aside from the occasional shadows seen out of the corner of my eye, seeing people who turned out to not be there, and hearing strange sounds, the cemetery was actually a quite peaceful place. But the strangest is when you have a burial in the crypts. Basically, you dig down about 4 or 5 feet to expose giant cement doors. You pull the cement doors off and drop down into a little room. These rooms can fit 2 coffins, or years and years and years worth of cremated remains. So back in the 50s and 60s, families would buy one crypt and the entire fam would be cremated and put in it. Some just put the cremated remains in it and close her up, but others light candles and leave flowers and souvenirs and pictures and It's freaking creepy opening up one of those bad boys after 50 years and finding melted candles and old pictures of the people inside. Plus when you hop down in there you have a weird realization that you are at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. Edit. RIP my inbox. Thanks for the silver kind stranger. And just to clarify, I am originally from the Midwest, so weed eating is a relatively normal term used to say you're going to go whack some weeds. How do you just casually mention random shadows and people who weren't really there and then talk about how creepy the melted candles were? Like that's some next level minding your own business. Strange people visiting. I worked at the cemetery Jimi Hendrix is buried at, so lots of weed and people hanging around. We found a dead homeless man behind a mausoleum, smelled him first. One time, getting ready to bury a person, we dug a grave. It was in a section of the graveyard that had very old burials, 100+ years, so wooden caskets. My foreman at the time was squaring off the hole with a shovel, then he saw a skull looking right at him. He quickly and quietly pushed it farther into the dirt and told us not to say anything. If the office people had found out, it would have been a whole thing. Digging it up, trying to figure out who it was, etc. Never saw a ghost, but some of the old timers say they did. Not sure if I believe them. Lots of other stories, but that stands out. I worked for a county cemetery department years ago. We would go to all the cemeteries in the county and mow or just do basic upkeep. Occasionally people, mainly farmers, would stumble upon some headstones in a field or a stand of trees and we would come out and prod the ground with dowel rods to find more headstones and re-establish the cemetery. Soon after I started working there we got a tip about some headstones a farmer found while clearing out a path through some trees for easier access to his field. It turned out to be the oldest cemetery in the county dating back to the 1700s. After investigating some of the names on the headstones it got really creepy. The story is that before the cemetery was there a schoolhouse stood there. The teachers were a husband and wife. It's not clear on what exactly happened but the students and the husband and wife all died in the schoolhouse. The information we found kind of made it sound like an illness of some kind and they were all quarantined in the school until they all died. After that the school was demolished and the students and husband and wife were all buried right where the school stood. So yeah, I'm sure it's haunted. I used to mow the lawn at a cemetery as part of my summer job. I always volunteered because it was the only place I could work with my shirt off and try to fight my farmer's tan. Anyway, the only creepy thing is that coffins must break and fill with dirt over time because once in a while you'll be walking and sink up to your knee in a small sinkhole on top of a grave. Didn't really bother me unless I was walking at a good pace, but some of the other people would get freaked out by that. When I was in college I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery in reception office management. The cemetery was closed from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening for Sabbath. We sometimes stayed a bit later in the office on Friday afternoons to get bills out or checks processed. We heard a loud commotion by the cemetery entrance, which was locked and only staff could get in and out. The office manager went to see what was going on and made me come with her. We went down to the gate to find an older woman, probably around 70, dressed to the nines, begging us to let her in. She kept saying she needed to get back. This was in the suburbs of NJ, so you needed a car to get around, but we didn't see a car or anything. She was just there in this beautiful dress. We couldn't open the gate without the cemetery manager, so we went to go get him. We brought him back to the gate and no one was there. We looked at video footage of the entrance and you could see us, the office manager and me, talking, but there was no one on the other side of the gate. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I swear to this day we saw a woman in a fancy dress outside that gate. There were multiple cameras and not a single one picked up anyone on the other side of the gate, and you could see the whole gate. All you could see was us. I don't know if it was a ghost or what. The office manager and I decided not to tell anyone else, but we would mention it to each other every once in a while. I dug graves for 6 months. One afternoon we had to hand dig a hole in an older cemetery BC. We couldn't run any heavy equipment over any of the older plots. It was super tough and took us a lot longer than usual. When we were finally close to be done, it was dark and hard to see. I remember my shovel hitting a brick of the neighboring plot, before cement casks, and it coming loose. I swear to God I saw something move inside the small hole and practically jumped out of the grave. I got back in to finish the job, but was definitely spooked. It's not quite the same, but I had an uncle who tried working, as in selling and doing drugs, the graveyards between 10 PM and 4 AM. He only lasted a few nights in that area, then never went back. What was it that scared him so badly that he felt his soul rattle in his bones, as his blood froze cold? Prairie dogs. Fucking prairie dogs. What's so frightening about simple ground squirrels, you might ask? Those cute little fuzzballs that scavenge whatever they can. Well, apparently they like to randomly come out their holes in the middle of the night and scream. Creepy, but that doesn't sound too bad, right? Well, now imagine being surrounded by dozens of little rodents you can't see, in the pitch black of night, surrounded by the dead, tweaked out of your mind, paranoid as hell, and then suddenly hearing hellish blood-curdling screaming all around you. His little group scattered like roaches, and I think someone fell into a ditch, but he was convinced it was an empty grave. He never did that again. Edit. Row, Sliver. Thank you so much. I'm honestly just glad so many have enjoyed my uncle's story and that it wasn't completely lost beneath all of the others. D. I don't work in a cemetery, but I did go clean one up with my family. We cut down weeds, planted flowers, so anyways I was wiping off graves when I seen 3 graves side by side and they didn't have the same last name, so I asked my mom if they were related and she said no, but a woman was married to them and they had all gotten into accidents within 2 years of being married to her. She buried them side by side and when she passed away she requested to be buried in a cemetery 2 counties away. It's strange because the first grave the man died in 1984, the second died in 1986 and the third died in 1988. They were all very wealthy and owned their own businesses, and when they died she closed the businesses. We had a late afternoon service once that ran into the evening. It was October, so the sun went down early while I was filling in the grave afterwards. Conveniently none of the lights on the loader tractor worked for some reason. No blown fuses or loose wires or anything, the lights just didn't work. Next day when I reported the issue we went over to the same tractor and the lights worked perfectly fine, and they worked fine the rest of the time I worked there. I used to work for a small company that would help set up monuments in cemeteries all over the states of VA and WV. The only strange thing I can really remember ever happening was when I went to this one small, unsettling town that had a real Twilight Zone feel to it. The guy whose brother we just set up a footstone for handed me a little brown cross on a string necklace. Later that night that thing turned blood red. I think I still have that cursed item somewhere. As for scary stuff, I ran into some skinheads while lost in West Virginia. As a brown dude, it was quite the scare. I just noped out before the three did anything other than size me up. Back in the day, graveyards were used as parks. People would picnic, kids would play, then they started building city parks, so the practice subsided. That whole concept reminds me of Dia de los Muertos. I personally have had bag lunches in one of my local cemeteries, especially in an old section overlooking a lake. I did it for the peace and quiet and view. My city took that to another level and declared the real old cemetery with the local known people to an official park. Some of the gravestones are came and go sports. It was an interesting summer when that came out. When I lived in Guam, I was impressed by their huge cemeteries with their gigantic white monuments, and was wandering through at dusk one day and saw a mist rising from one particular monument, and being a little freaked, left quickly. It happened a few times and I was seriously starting to question my sanity, so the next time I saw it I decided to approach to see detail, only to find that it was a very sad brother having a cigarette with his deceased brother. I told him he had scared the crap out of me, and he said that he'd seen plenty of things there to make him question his sanity. A lady in my hometown would walk her 2 Irish wolfhounds through one of my local cemeteries. It sure was freaky to see as a kid, before I knew that dogs as large as wolfhounds could exist. Other kids also saw them from time to time, and there was a local legend about these 2 massive wolf-like specters wandering through. The rumors were sometimes out of control, and people said the demon dogs could appear and vanish at will, had red eyes, etc. As a kid in 1982, and Michael Jackson's Thriller was on everyone's minds. One night it was getting late when we got caught in a big rainstorm, so we called it quits on our basketball game and went our separate ways. The big cemetery I cut through must have closed up for the night, and I found the gates locked. Going around would take forever, so I decided to climb over the fence, only to land hard on the other side. It was muddy, so I not only wrenched my ankle pretty bad but took a giant mud bath. I was covered in mud, limping, and groaning from pain when I reached the other side. As I emerged from the darkness, a couple saw me limping and groaning, while trying to squeeze through the cemetery's wrought iron fence. I remember their screams to this day. I used to work as a park ranger in a cemetery in London which has been converted into a nature reserve. It's in a very ghetto area. The local kids nicknamed it the Forest. Regularly we'd find ammunition, knives and occasionally pistols hidden in the memorial's gravestones, and the police would be called to collect them. A friend once found a backpack full of Molotov cocktails prepared. I never saw a pistol myself. Only once I had the honor of finding something. I found a plastic bag stuffed behind a collapsed monument, and inside it had a load of shotgun shells. It was terrifying for me because you have no idea if someone is watching you or aware that you've just found their stash. The police come, you have to show them where it is, and that further highlights your involvement to any of the local kids watching you. That particular park people avoid as soon as the sun goes down. I was a tombstone caretaker for a cemetery in rural Georgia. Summertime job for a 16-year-old. Nothing crazy, just cleaning off the grime of the elements on tombstones act. Now to just put a setting, the cemetery included one building that housed bathrooms for the 5 staff members of the cemetery, a small simple mausoleum, and then other than that, flat earth with tombstones everywhere. The only surroundings were dense forests in the Georgia country. That being said, due to the eerie surroundings, I was always a bit paranoid, plus I watch a lot of scary movies and so on. I know, bad combo. So one night I was doing my rounds, and I had to go into the smaller mausoleum, had some of the richer families in the areas entombed within, and I had to go in. Macaja all was neat and clean, standards had to be upheld for these uppity folks. So I approached, and right off the bat, something was off. The air was pretty damn cold. During the summer in Georgia, That was odd. There was a light coming from the mausoleum, and as I approached, I heard voices, laughter. Laughter from a child, a little girl. I thought it was simply younger folks maybe. I haven't seen anyone enter or leave the cemetery, and the laughter sounded young. However, as I got closer, the voices and laughter died, like almost instant. I pause. The light I also noticed had gone out. I call the lone security officer that does a few rounds on the lot, cause I'm not gonna go in alone, and he comes. We will call him Officer Friendly. When Officer Friendly arrives, we both go inside. We see one of the doors to the entombed remains of a young girl open. Nothing was disturbed within, but it was open, and a doll lay on the stone beneath it. Me and Officer Friendly do a small sweep. It was only one floor and one room, so it didn't take long. We close the door to the girl's entombment, and we both leave. As we walk away, we get about 30 feet from the mausoleum, and then all of a sudden, boom, voices and laughter again. I jump, and Officer Friendly looks to me, looking pretty shaken, says to me, "You hear it too?" We look back, and boom, lights back, laughter continuing. We don't go back and just book it. I found out the next morning, the door was open again. This time the doll was on the other side of the mausoleum from where we found it the night before. I resigned the next day. I'm good lol. Edit. Thanks for the first Reddit silver lol. Worked in a cemetery over the summer during college. One morning I was mowing the grounds and discovered the body of a cat which had been bound and set on fire. I once worked for a graveyard in Florida for a couple months. One day they were digging a grave and went home early. They left the excavator there, and on my lunch break I was sitting near it when I heard someone banging on the machine. Now this ain't it settling, no, this was someone taking a hammer and hitting it on the machine. I figured someone was working on it, but it just kept hitting. After 7 minutes or so I walk over to see what's going on, and nothing. No one is there, and it stopped when I approached the machine. I also live down the street from this graveyard and I go by it constantly. One time I saw a lady roaming around the graveyard at night. I don't know if it was an actual person or not, but it creeped me out a fair bit. I take care of a small family mausoleum. The family that is buried there has no living descendants, so it falls to me to clean out the facility and replace the flowers inside the building. I also make sure that there's no damage to the mausoleum. I've become very acquainted with the family that is buried inside. One day, as I was closing up my office, my phone rang, and when I answered it there was a very agitated woman on the other end. She was very clearly under the influence of something. She asked me repeatedly if I knew where Jane Smith was. Jane Smith has been buried in the mausoleum since the early 1900s. I asked her why she needed to know. The woman very calmly asked me to go to the mausoleum to double check that Jean was still there because she believed that she was her. I assured her that I was pretty sure Jean was still peacefully buried, and our phone conversation ended a few moments later. Drugs and alcohol are a hell of a thing, but it still creeped me out enough that I don't answer my phone after 5 PM any longer, and I make sure someone is with me when I go to the cemetery. Grave digger here. Nothing scary or weird ever, but about once a week I chase people off that were either shooting up or having sex. Had a couple ODs because about 60 of the cemeteries I do are in very drug heavy neighborhoods. One time we had a woman shoot herself at the top of the cemetery while we were down below. Other than that, the ghosts and ghouls leave us alone even on late nights. There was an old cemetery next to my cousin's house. Next to one of the headstones there was a hole from a groundhog or something. There were scraps of old fabric coming out of the hole. Don't work in a graveyard, but was staying with friends who live at the top of a hill, with the graveyard being the main route, not for cars, down. I ride a bike and passed one night cycling down the hill through the graveyard that it was easier to cycle with my lights off, as the difference between the light and pitch black was so extreme that I couldn't see anything around the lit area at all. My lights aren't great. There I am cycling along in the pitch black through a graveyard on a fairly steep hill. I kinda get a bit freaked or every so often and so would stop and turn the light on, have a look around, check I was on the path still and then carry on. One time I did this, discovered that I was less than a foot away from falling into an open grave. I did some restoration work with a group of miners prospectors at the Granite City graveyard in the Kootenays of British Columbia. Someone went through the cemetery and desecrated every grave they could locate. Wooden head plates graffitied, any visible burial dug up. There were bones sticking up everywhere and it was infuriating. Whoever did it wasn't just looking for treasure, they wanted to destroy the place. I also once discovered a bunch of Chinese burials near Summit Creek by Barkerville. I was digging on bedrock, and these piles of hand-stacked rocks on either side of the creek had little mounds on them. Turns out I accidentally dug into one of them and had quite a shock. That spot in particular is really creepy. It feels like you're being watched, judged by people all around you. In the morning the area is usually filled with mist or fog and you can almost pick out shapes moving around in it. I am sure it was my imagination. I don't work at a cemetery but I do have a story. Just outside my hometown there is a small castle. Brief history, it was a mod in 1100s and slowly progressed to a castle and Georgian residence throughout time. There is a small burial ground outside of it and my friends decided to investigate the local rumors about a shining light that shone in a powerless section of the place. Anyways, we got there, saw the light and roamed the grounds for somewhere near an hour. It was a very uneasy place so we decided to leave. We got attacked by a flock of birds. When I got back to my car outside the grounds to drive home I got an unexpected call from my mother asking was I alright and that she had gotten a very bad feeling about me crossing her mind. I let her know I was fine and would be home in the next 15-20 minutes, not to be worrying about nothing. Cut to about 5 minutes later after I had ended the call and was beginning my drive home. I was pulling out onto the main road and a car with no lights on, in the pitch dark, came and smashed into the side of my car. Nobody was seriously hurt. If the car with no lights had been 5 seconds later she would probably have killed my friend in the following car as she would have hit his driver's door rather than my rear door. I will always remember that night. It felt as though we shouldn't have ever been there and an incident was bound to happen with the feeling around that place. Have never been there since. This was about 6 years ago. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a comment.